Our oceans are full of microscopic organisms that play an important role in the ecosystem. However, when these microorganisms get too plentiful, they can cause dangerous algae blooms that harm humans and ocean life. One type of harmful algae bloom that frequently occurs in the Gulf of Mexico is red tide. What is red tide? Algae blooms like red tide are natural occurrences caused by high amounts of nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. Some blooms are seasonal events triggered by ocean currents causing an upwelling of nutrients from the bottom of the ocean. Hurricanes and other large storms can cause red tide through a similar process. Ocean salinity, temperature, and wind all affect the creation and size of red tide blooms. Pollution, mainly from agriculture and sewer runoff, raises water temperature and provides an abundance of nutrients for microorganisms to feed on. This increases the chance of red tide and makes the blooms more severe. The extent of humans' effect on red tide is not fully known. While the term red tide is used to describe many types of harmful algae blooms, the red tide that most frequently occurs in the Gulf of Mexico is referred to as Florida red tide. Red tide blooms have been documented in Florida since the 1800s and are almost always a yearly occurrence with varying levels of intensity. Red tide is most frequently occurs in the summer when the water temperature and other conditions promote algae blooms. During Florida red tides, the algae becomes so plentiful that the seawater appears to be red or brown. Impacts on humans and wildlife. Red tide has devastating effects on the ocean ecosystem, one of which is the creation of dead zones. Dead zones are created when the algae responsible for red tide starts to die. The algae's decaying process consumes the oxygen in the ocean, causing fish and other sea creatures to die in large numbers. The fish are unable to escape the dead zone as lack of oxygen makes them lose consciousness almost immediately. The algae responsible for red tide produces natural toxins, and when present in large amounts, the toxins can kill dolphins, turtles, marine birds, and manatees. The toxins are so potent that within minutes of being exposed to red tide, fish begin to swim erratically and then become paralyzed. The fish exposed die within an hour. Humans can get shellfish poisoning from eating food that was not properly tested for toxins or have been harvested incorrectly. The red tide toxins cause skin to be irritated if you have been swimming in the ocean, and eye irritation and respiratory problems can occur if the toxins enter the air. This can become a serious problem for people who already have respiratory issues. An easy way to prevent red tide is to limit the use of fertilizers, as the nutrients that are present within them feed the algae that causes red tide. Red tide is a growing problem, and researchers are working to determine ways to halt the growing number of red tide blooms. Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission actively monitors the Gulf and gives updates on red tide blooms.